Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. Putting the world's farm animals into retirement. That's the mission of this, the plant-based sensation with a definite radical streak. Whether it's throwing a Michelin-starred dinner, fooling food journalists they're eating meat, or getting an Ed Sheeran lookalike to serve vegan chicken nuggets in a van, this know how to cause a stir. I'm speaking to the co-founder, Andy Shubble, today. Andy's new venture is a bit weird, an animal advocacy charity, taking the same irreverent, funny and controversial approach to campaigning we've come to know and love at this. Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
So Andy, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
I was independent from quite a young age. I had a set of parents who didn't necessarily and still don't really think the same as me in terms of worldview about pretty much anything. And so I wasn't one of those people that necessarily sort of lent on their parents for early life stage guidance and moral compass and that sort of thing. I'm not saying they're terrible people, but I certainly didn't sort of align with them on very much and still don't. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why I've ended up going a bit left field on certain things, is because I've been cruising solo when it comes to, I suppose, my own ideology and the way I look at the world.
Can you think of an early example of that? When can you first remember, having a real disagreement or mismatch with your parents? What was it about?
Quite a few. I suppose that the most meaningful one, which was probably the most formative for me, was I wanted to go to boarding school when I was younger, and I was one of the only kids I ever knew of that lobbied and elected to go to boarding school rather than get sent there. I went to a sort of private boarding school, and almost all the kids in the school were sort of, for the first few months or the first year or two, they were quite grumpy about the fact that they'd been sort of sent there, like pinged off by their parents who were desperate for some peace and quiet. Whereas I kind of elected to go there. And it was a big point of conflict between me and my parents because neither of them wanted me to go. So I had to fight quite hard to do that. So that's probably the first thing I can recall that was quite meaningful.
So that must be talking, age 10, that you were campaigning with your parents for that?
Yeah, I went to boarding school age 13, so probably like age 12 or something like that.
And why did you want to go?
We're getting quite deep very quickly, but I think that specifically, probably the most compelling reasons were that I just didn't really enjoy the unstable home life that came with divorce. I wasn't kind of famously getting on with my parents necessarily. I think I also was cognizant of the sort of independent way I was starting to sort of see the world, think about things, the way I wanted to do things without necessarily being sort of tethered by my parents. So yeah, probably a bit of that. I think I saw it as a shortcut to like more independence.
Really interesting. And I'm sure we can draw a line here between that kind of feeling and wanting the freedom, wanting the independence, and then becoming a kind of serial entrepreneur, right? Have you drawn that line for yourself?
Perhaps somewhat. I think the most obvious line to be drawn is that if you come from privilege, it's much easier to be a founder. People don't talk about it enough, in my opinion. And people come up to people like me and say like, oh, well done for your career and stuff. But I don't think it's very impressive when somebody has come from relative privilege and then they have started companies and that kind of stuff, because the skill set, the network and everything else that you have is just so different from people who don't come from privilege. So that's probably the most obvious line I would draw. In answer to your question, yeah, perhaps a dotted line can be drawn between that career outcome and the early kind of independent way of thinking.
Thank you for acknowledging the privilege point. I agree with you. Actually, at the time of recording, there's been a bit of a stir around a couple of founders who were brothers, founded different companies, and they did a kind of slightly tone-deaf campaign where they were referring to both of their companies and this kind of rivalry when, their father is a multimillionaire and has obviously supported them through the founding of their businesses. So I think that is a very good thing to draw attention to.
I'd like to point out my father's not a multimillionaire.
Fair enough, yeah.
Far from it. But yeah, no, still obviously early days came from privilege for sure.
I do think there's something interesting there in that from an early age, you wanted that independence and you wanted to forge your own path. I speak to a lot of founders who say something along the lines of, well, I was just never going to be employable. I was just never going to be able to work for someone else just because of my personality and the way I worked. And I spoke to Guy Singh Watson from Riverford, who said he was, trying to get fired from his first job for about 3 years and instead kept getting promoted. So in the end, you just had to walk away. But do you identify with that? Working for someone else didn't really appeal to you?
Yeah, working for someone else did not appeal to me, probably because of some deep-seated arrogance that I could do it better myself or something like that. I used to go around saying, oh, I was just ended up doing this stuff because I'm unemployable, haha. And then I realized, just not to overdo the privilege point, but I realized it's actually the staple kind of statement of somebody who's enormously privileged. It's kind of very unself-aware because we are employable.
Yeah, of course, there's plenty of privileged people working in big businesses around the world, of course.
Yeah, I've stopped saying that now because it's almost like a humble brag kind of thing.
Loving this reflection, Andy. Do you think as an adult that you've become more radical or less radical, and what's been behind that?
I think I have become more radical. In fact, I don't think I have. I definitely have. Having said that, the thing I'm most radical about is our treatment towards animals. I say that through gritted teeth that I'm radical about that, because to me, it's radical to do what we do to them rather than radical to speak up against it. But we are where we are, so I must concede to being an outlier.
Yeah, I mean, listeners to this podcast will know that I'm a passionate vegan, and so you're preaching to the converted here. But, I do agree with that. Obviously, when you start getting into the processes of what I think people perhaps still think about in a kind of rose-tinted sort of pastoral myth of farming and, nice farmer, nice fields, nice happy animals, everyone's smiley, and then, sadly, we have to kill them, but, greater good. When you start scratching under the surface of what that process looks like, it's actually nothing like that image. And when do you first remember being aware of that, or really being woken up to that, or paying attention to that?
Yeah, I remember it very distinctly, actually. I was dating a girl called Alex, and she was really fun and somewhat crazy. I hope she won't mind me saying if she ever listens, which she probably won't. We only dated for a couple of months, and she showed me a video on her phone of little fluffy chicks going down a conveyor belt and then being fed in a seemingly endless stream into a grinder alive. And to me, it seemed like some sort of snuff video, some really extreme kind of content. And I asked her what it was because she didn't really tee me up with what it was going to be. And she said, that's what happens in the egg industry. And so I was completely shocked and asked what she meant. And she went on to explain that male chicks born into the egg industry, which is obviously half of all the chicks born into the egg industry, do not lay eggs and so are treated as a waste product. So whenever you buy eggs from the supermarket, she said, you are paying for these machines to do this to animals. And they also go into gas chambers if they're not ground up alive like this. And it's in the UK alone, about 30 million male chicks are treated this way. And globally, it's in the billions. So that was the first moment. It was about 7, 8, probably more than that, 9 years ago now. It started to get me thinking. It didn't turn me on a dime. So I didn't kind of become vegan overnight. It got me thinking. I was still then running a meat-based restaurant business. So I was committing animal genocide, really, compared to most people. And in the end, we sold the business in 2016. And that's really when I started to kind of turn, I guess, and start to be more conscious about all of this stuff.
Well, fantastic. That brings us nicely onto this. So you've already mentioned that you had run a previous business with your co-founder, Pete. When did you start this, and what was that early time like, and what was the thinking behind it? And paint a picture for us.
We started trading about 4.5 years ago, but obviously me and Pete were working before that for about 1.5 to 2 years on the kind of planning and fundraising and R&D. Funnily enough, in reverse order, the R&D was the biggest job. And the initial thinking behind the business was like very unromantic and kind of uninspiring. It was more just we went down this long journey for about a year plus, actually, a year and a bit, of discovery about what we wanted to do next. And we looked at all kinds of wacky ideas, like electric supercar brand that we wanted to start. We looked at automation in the barbers industry. We looked at dispensing people's prescription meds automatically using like categorized bags, all kinds of stuff. And we spent weeks or months on each idea before finding a reason not to do it. And then one of us said, have you seen what's going on with Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat in the States? This is back in like 2017. And we then kind of pivoted, looked at the UK from there, and it was clear that nothing really that interesting was going on, in our opinion. And we felt the products and the brands were probably last gen, and that they weren't really appealing for meat eaters in terms of quality or even the brand messaging. So we ended up at this very unexotic, unromantic conclusion that it looked like a good business opportunity, frankly, and we weren't really very mission driven at all. We did decide quite early on that we wanted our careers to then progress into the sustainable world somehow. So there was that fundamental bedrock there of wanting to do constructive things. But I have been on this personal journey of, I suppose I would say, enlightenment and finding my purpose when it comes to stopping animal cruelty after the fact, after we started working on this. And I've been fully plant-based for 3-4 years now. And I was vegetarian for about a year before that.
Easter egg for listeners is that Andy and I used to share an office. And I remember that when we shared that office, I basically kept popping down to see if there was some free food on offer. I remember you talking about how you were kind of on that journey and trying to go plant-based. So it's good to know that you got there. And I think I'm a big believer in direction, not perfection. I've spoken to hundreds of people about this issue and about this thing over the years. And it really is, people go up and down, people become vegan, they go back to vegetarian, they go vegan again. And I really think if everyone just did a little bit, and actually this is the mantra of the podcast, right? A little bit radical. If a lot of people made a little change, then that would be a really good thing. We don't need to go the whole way all the time necessarily. And everyone's not always ready for that. And I guess that must be one of the sources of inspiration for your products, because they do really taste like meat, right? And that must have been very important to you. Talk a bit about that R&D process and what goes into creating a plant-based product that really looks, feels, tastes like meat.
So I think if you're entering any new category as a challenger brand with no, existing customer base and not really that much money at the beginning, then you've got to have a product advantage. It's imperative. So it was just very clear to us from day one that we had to absolutely obliterate the existing competition in the UK when it came to product quality. So there was, a very clear mandate there. And in terms of what it takes and what the process is like, it just takes a lot of monotonous, soul-crushing repetitiveness and constant failures consecutively. Because R&D, probably for anything, is a journey of 600 no's followed by one yes when you're browbeaten and want to give up. So when it came to the development of our initial products, and frankly all the other products, we tried to hold really high standards when it comes to product quality. And I would say, if it's not too pompous, that we are probably world leading when it comes to texture, fat systems in products, aka succulent, and flavor and appearance. So to be world leading in anything, even if it's like standing on one leg and singing a particular song, you probably need to really practice and you need to work really hard at whatever your chosen kind of craft is. And our craft is obviously producing products which are as tasty as meat, but don't come from animals. And that's really difficult. To make peas and soybeans taste exactly like pork sausages or bacon is a tall order.
What do you think has been one of those biggest breakthrough moments on product for you? Was something that you tasted that the team came up with and you were like, wow?
I think when we had nailed our sausage, it wasn't one moment. It was a kind of incremental journey really to get to that point. But when we created the final signed off version of the sausage, I was completely convinced, and I actually still am, that it was the best plant-based sausage in the world. I'm completely convinced of that. Certainly the one I tasted, and it's kind of my job to taste what's out there. And it's kind of been proven really, because it's only been out for a couple of years. It's already the clear number 2 in the UK market out of like 20 something sausages on shelf. And I think we can chase down number 1 as well. So that was probably the biggest breakthrough moment. I just remember being absolutely astonished, even though I'd been there for each kind of increment of the improvements. I remember thinking at the end, I can't believe we've managed to get this close to port. It's just bonkers. So yeah, that's probably one that sticks out.
They are delicious. I'd agree with that. Definitely go and try them if you haven't. They are very delicious. Actually, this brings me on to another topic that I'd love to talk to you about, which is around your marketing activations and your slightly irreverent, fun, slightly controversial sometimes kind of way that you promote the brand. And with the sausage, I remember seeing that you took them down to a meat market, right? And were offering sausage butties around to all the butchers and, getting them to describe how delicious it was to be eating pork. Only to reveal later that it was plant-based. Talk about that activation as an example of your approach to marketing at this.
We've actually picked out one of the least controversial ones we've ever done. A lot of our marketing and comms is all about shocking people, not in the traditional sense necessarily of like, using any grotesque material or anything like that, but shocking them into the realization that there is plant-based food out there compelling enough to completely fool your average meat eater. I don't think many people are actually aware that that's the case, because not many brands have products, frankly, if I can be really arrogant, not many brands have products that can do that. And historically, certainly none of them really had. So that's why you'll see a lot of our videos have either an undertone or a very clear kind of overtone of people being tricked by the food. It's been our thing. We're just driving that home again and again and again. The other thing about our marketing, which is still true about this example, is we want it to be entertaining and funny. We want the viewer to actually feel something when they watch it. And that might be shock, or it might be surprise, or it might just be they feel amused. And it's a very deliberate tactic, and it might look like we're just kind of aimlessly having a laugh, but I kind of built conviction really early on before we launched that people are quite defensive on the whole about vegan stuff. When they hear the word vegan or the phrase plant-based, they think that the rest of their way of life is sort of somewhat like under siege, and they're being indirectly criticized, and they need to sort of defend eating meat. And it's just a very poor word association, which has been built up over many years of activism that people haven't necessarily had consensus with. And so I decided that the best way to lower people's defenses and kind of get them to be more open to consideration was to just use humor and have a laugh and entertain people. And I figured that if they came across a brand that really was relatable to them and their sense of humor, then perhaps they would lower their guard and try the products, even if it was plant-based.
I think humour is massively underutilized in advertising generally. There's actually some pretty big thought leaders in the industry, Rory Sutherland and the Mark Ritsons of the world, who were saying the same. We've become so saturated with advertising and marketing, but you can always make people have a good laugh, and that's always a good thing to do and associate with your brand. You teed me up nicely, Andy, because I picked one of the least controversial campaigns. What would you say has been the most controversial, and what was that like?
There have been a couple, and controversial in different ways. We've had campaigns which were very controversial for the vegan community, because we walk this kind of very difficult tightrope between needing to be relatable to meat eaters and drive trial in the meat eating world, but also not alienate our vegan customers. And the tricky thing about that, in case anybody hasn't realized, is that the two groups have completely opposing worldviews when it comes to food and animals. So it's a very difficult thing to do. Very, very, very difficult. It's like trying to sell something to a massive contingent of pacifists whilst also selling the same product to a massive group of warmongering kind of maniacs. It's really different. Not to suggest that meat eaters and vegans are related to those two groups.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, let listeners decide which group is which in that, in that example.
It was an unrelated analogy for sure, but it's very difficult. And so stunts and marketing activations which have landed quite poorly with vegans, there are a few of them, but the one that sticks out is we made this video. I mean, I was sorry. I said sorry, and I was sorry, and I am sorry. But it also, for me, highlights some of the issues with veganism, in my opinion. We made a video a few years ago, which was quite a small, just a bit of Instagram content. We never really intended it to go to the press or anything. So we got together, I think it was about 7 or 8 vegans and a couple of vegetarians as well. And we offered them in the video to try meat for the first time, either in their lives or the first time in 5-10 years. And of course, they didn't know this, but the meat we were giving them was our product. So we were never going to give anyone meat. And the vegans said, all right, go on then. And we paid them all, I think 100. And they tasted our sausage or our bacon or chicken or whatever. And they made all the faces you'd expect. I'm like, oh God, it's so meaty. It's just like the weirdest thing. Oh my God. And, it was kind of the exact kind of reaction you'd expect. And it was good fun. Anyway, that was it. It got picked up by some of the vegan community and vegan blogs and press. And the issue that they had with it was we had claimed that these people were vegans, but they were willing to try meat, being paid. And they all spat it out. But nonetheless, the sanctity of the vegan church was threatened. In their opinion, we had misappropriated the word vegan. Now, a defense which we used that I would say is fairly a credible one, was that the people told us they were vegans. So I'm not one to tell many people what they are. I'd rather hear from them what they think they are. So these people told us they were vegans, and so we called them vegans. Now, what I'm sorry for and what I apologize for at the time is that we weren't more sensitive and conscious of how that would land with vegans. So I'm not sitting here being snide and kind of undermining my apology at the time, because we were sorry for that and we are sorry for that. But it also highlights to me how there are some vegans, quite a lot, in fact, I would say, who prioritize the church of veganism and the doctrine of veganism more than animals. Because if you took a step back and you were rational about that episode, you would probably determine, in my opinion, that that video was actually designed to, and probably did, lead to a net reduction of animal suffering, even on a small level, right? Because it's our marketing and we're promoting our products to meat eaters, and end of story. But I think people didn't take that view at the time in the vegan world, and they took a different view, which is that we were undermining the valued term of veganism. I'm not aligned with that kind of approach.
Really interesting. And I can see both sides of that. But I think ultimately I land on the pragmatist side of this debate where, as we've already talked about, the more versions of the change in the right direction we can get, the better. And if everyone's consenting adults, then what's the harm? My personal favourite campaigns of yours is when you created that video about sponsoring the village of Quorn. For those who don't know, Quorn is a village in Leicestershire, actually about 10 minutes away from where I grew up. So that's why it's one of my favourites. It's actually where I used to play rugby. But obviously it's the same as the brand name, Quorn, the plant-based product. Have you ever got into any legal trouble with this kind of thing, with competitors or otherwise?
Yes, we have got into some worse than legal trouble in a sense. We got into criminal trouble once.
Oh, blimey.
Yeah, we managed to get out of it. I managed to get out of it. But yeah, we did have a real problem on our hands once through our marketing.
Go on, you have to tell us about that. Come on.
All right, so I ran an Instagram competition because a meatball tray manufacturer, so in other words, the plastic tray that all the meatballs sit in, they sent us a message saying, hi, if you want, we can emboss a logo or a word at the bottom of each meatball cavity. So you've got those circular dents in each of the meatball placements. And there are about 12 of them, I think. I was like, oh, fantastic. We'll do an Instagram competition and let our community decide what goes there, and I'll be the judge. So we go off and set this up on Instagram. We get loads of responses. People are really engaged. And I picked the winner, which I thought was the funniest. And it was a word in each meatball cavity that spelt out, if you read the whole thing, hi, my name's Sam, and I'm being held hostage in a meatball tray factory. Send help or something. Or lots of love or something. I can't remember what the sign off was, and this was embossed in the plastic. When you emptied your meatball tray, you'd be able to see it. And I forget about it. It goes into production. And then about 6 weeks later, I am on a work trip somewhere out of town. I think it was in Europe somewhere. And I get a really panicked phone call from Pete in the office, who tells me that a convoy of police cars has arrived to arrest me. About 3 people had called the police. And they had called Special Branch, who is the department of the police that deals with the most serious crimes like human trafficking. And Special Branch had obviously enough conviction that I was a nasty criminal that they would come and arrest me, basically. And the guys in the office had to show the police all of the details behind the campaign and show them that it was a joke, and nobody was very amused. But the police, in their investigation before they came to our office, had phoned our supermarket partners. So they phoned Waitrose, Tesco and Sainsbury's, I think. So that led to some serious problems on that side of things as well. And we managed to kind of smooth everything over, but we were quite close to losing millions of pounds of business because of this mistake. So that's an example of when we were sort of too close to the line.
Having looked at the various things you've done, I wouldn't have said that was the most controversial. It's really interesting. You can't predict these things sometimes, can you? We've talked a little bit about the approach to veganism, the church of veganism. It feels like a good opportunity to talk about your new venture. So tell us all about A Bit Weird.
So A Bit Weird is an animal advocacy charity, which I'm just in the process of founding. And it will focus on the cruelest aspects of the way we treat animals either in the food system or in fashion or animal testing. Doesn't matter. I'm agnostic about where the suffering happens. And I think that the real USP will be that we will use humor and almost this style kind of punky marketing to hopefully lower the barrier for consensus for the mainstream masses and people that weren't necessarily interested in animal rights or animal cruelty, people that perhaps roll their eyes when they see stuff about veganism or about animal cruelty. I want to attract those people and start to provoke thought among those people. And my goals will include, charities' goals will include changing the laws to benefit animals and taking animals out of harm kind of any which way. Because I'm going to be part-time, I'm still in my business career, so I'm going to be part-time running a charity. So I need to be quite focused. And the first project I'm going to work on, or already have started working on, is to eliminate the culling of male chicks in the egg industry, which was kind of nostalgic for me because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, that was the first thing I ever saw, which got me down the road. And the reason why I picked it is because it's really quite high impact. If we're successful and we ban it, it's like millions and millions of animals that are not suffocated in gas chambers or ground up alive. And it's also very gratuitous suffering, so you do not need to do it. There's technology which allows us to avoid doing that in the egg industry. And I just like fluffy little chicks. So that is going to be the first project. I want to make it illegal to cull chicks because I think it's barbaric. And I'm going to try and get the public on board with a campaign and then eventually hopefully get the law changed.
That's fantastic. Well, good luck. I can't imagine many of our listeners having an objection to saving fluffy little chicks. I think that's a good first cause. I'm quite interested that you've chosen to set up an activist organisation, a separate organisation. How do you view the role of brands in activism and furthering, progressive societies and sustainable changes and that kind of thing? Why do you feel that you can't achieve your goals in the business world? So you have to set up a separate entity.
So I'll tell you a quick anecdote, which was told to me by a man called Paul Shapiro, who I think it's fair to say I have a man crush on. I really love him. He is an animal activist from the States, and I had a call with him to just get some advice. He's also now set up a sort of fermented meat alternative company. But he's done a lot for animals, much more than I have in the States. He's changed the lives of animals through activism. And he told me this anecdote. So in the 1900s, there were millions of horses throughout the United States and the world, but he's from the States. So there were millions of horses in the States, and they were the predominant vehicle asset for the logistics of both human transportation, but also in industry as well. They were the backbone of America, really, the horses. And there were early animal activists who were campaigning day after day, year after year for better treatment for horses. And they would get these tiny incremental wins every few years, like getting water troughs in every other town so that horses could drink in the height of summer and not just drop dead on their travels and be replaced by another horse. And really, in spite of all their admirable efforts, they made very little progress. Along comes Henry Ford, who doesn't give a flying F about horses. And he instantly liberates all horses virtually in the United States and then across the world by inventing the combustion engine and therefore the personal transportation vehicle, which we know as the car. So it's a really good example of time where a company can come along with absolutely zero interest in animal activism, but can liberate millions of animals overnight through innovation. And it really got me thinking when Paul told this to me. So it kind of renewed my vigor for growing this. So I think companies like this do have a really, really important role. But I also think that work needs to be done alongside business to get people to reframe how they see animals, because way too often in animal activism, there's this underlying assumption that if people just knew what went on, and let's all show them all the atrocities in these horrible gulags that are industrial farms, they'll just go vegan because they'll see. And it's just that we've seen and they haven't seen. And actually, I think it's really naive. And the fact is, you can show people by the million and they won't make a change. So what we really need to tackle, in my opinion, is the speciesism. So a bit like sexism or racism, favoring one species way over other species and thinking that there's some God-given right, but given to one species, aka humans, to dominate, oppress, and exploit other species, aka all the animals. So that speciesism, I think, is quite rarely tackled by animal activist organizations. Examples like the crazy hypocrisy that we all have when we think we're a nation of animal lovers and we love dogs and we call ourselves animal lovers, and then we sit down and eat animals which have been terribly exploited and gone through terrible suffering and pain to be there. So there's this big disconnect, this big cognitive dissonance. And I think I want to work quite hard on that, because I don't believe if you just show people footage of what happens on farms, they will go vegan.
Really interesting. And even within the articulation of speciesism, and even not just between the human species and various animal species, as you said, even within, we have this interesting hierarchy of different animal species in our mind. We wouldn't want to eat a gorilla. We wouldn't want to eat a dog in our culture anyway. Different elsewhere in the world, how this all kind of plays out. Interesting. Yeah. So wish you huge luck with that. Let's move on to the last section of our podcast. We have been talking about a big issue for the world anyway, but the last section is a little bit radical world. So what is a little bit of a radical change that you would like to see people get behind that maybe you don't influence on a day-to-day basis?
At the moment, the status quo is that absolutely everyone can acquire a pet. And it's really normal. And I have complete conviction that it should not be normal and everyone should not have a pet. So I would love that my little radical change, is that we introduce some sort of basic comprehension test for potential pet owners, certainly a means test so that if the animal gets ill, they can afford to treat it. The same kind of basic checks that you would have if you adopted an animal or if you adopted a child. And I know they're not the same thing, but it's unthinkable that you would adopt a child without any kind of basic checks. And for the first 6 months, at least, there are some similarities between adopting a pet or owning a pet and adopting a child. Some similarities. I'm not saying they are the same.
I'm toilet training my child at the minute, so I'm with you. There's a lot of similarities.
Well, but both are completely helpless, completely innocent, and they both require your full focus and stewardship. I think that would be my change, to limit who can have a pet and who can't, because I think what we're all willfully a bit blind towards is how many, frankly, millions of animals are neglected in this country and abroad. So that would be my little radical change, to put some controls in for who can have a pet.
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because as you said, when you adopt a pet, you actually have to go through some checks, which a lot of people are quite surprised by, actually, home visits and that kind of thing. But you can go on, social media and buy a pet, within 10 seconds, you can take that pet home. Something does feel a bit strange about that, I think.
Yeah, it's a sort of perception of having a God-given right when I'm not sure why. It's just legacy, but I'd love for that to change.
I have to be careful here because you're getting close to one of my potential big radical changes, which is the same thing for potential parents. I think we have to be very careful there, I think. It's been great to speak to you. The last question we ask is always the same, which is that if there's someone listening to this podcast who has a little bit of a radical idea for themselves or for a business or for their personal life, whatever it might be, what advice would you give them?
Well, probably don't necessarily just do it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Here's the odd podcast and I see YouTube videos of people in some position of influence or other just saying, just go and do it. And if you've got a radical idea, if you've got something world-changing, just follow your heart. I think we're not sensitive enough to the fact that some people are kind of maniacs, have really toxic worldviews. And so perhaps just sense check your radical idea before you pursue it. And speak to people who have been around the block a few more times than you, and talk to people. If it's a business idea, go and speak to people. If you want to start a new skincare brand, go and get on LinkedIn and message people who work in the skincare industry in a senior position. They've been around a few years, and speak to them about your idea. I see a lot of young, early stage entrepreneurs and try and give them advice. And too often they're very inward looking and they don't seek the counsel of people who have either done it before or who have been in the space. And I think when you have a radical idea, become a sponge. Like I'm doing that with charity, right? Like I'm a relatively experienced business person, but I am approaching the new charity that I'm setting up as if I was a complete moron. And so I'm going from ground zero, basically. And I've probably met 30 people now who work in charity, or the animals space in general, and try to learn the basics. So that would be my advice. Don't just do it. Go and learn first and then decide whether you want to do it.
I think that is great. And yeah, we've had plenty of people saying a combination of those things, saying that, if it's your passion, definitely do it. But then I think the second part that you've raised is very, very important as well. An idea in itself has pretty much no value, and it will all be in the execution. And there are people out there who can help you learn how to best do that.
Or tell you whether it's a good idea.
Yes, or tell you, this is crazy. Definitely don't do it. Yeah. Which you can still choose to ignore, of course, but maybe not for the best. Andy, it's been wonderful to speak to you today. Thank you for giving us your time and sharing so many interesting nuggets. And I hope to see you again soon. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.